The stallion's hooves thundered against the steel walls of the auction pen like gunshots, each impact echoing through the dusty arena where dreams went to die. Blood streaked his midnight coat from countless failed attempts to scale the 8-foot barriers, and his eyes burned with the fury of a creature who had never known defeat until today. Lot 47, bellowed Auctioneer Cornelius Blackthorne, his voice cutting through the murmur of disappointed buyers. This here's what happens when you try to tame the untamable. 3 broken ribs on the last handler nearly killed a veterinarian and destroyed more property than a tornado. He gestured dismissively at the magnificent beast. I'm calling this one worthless. Who'll give me $50 for dog food? The crowd of ranchers and horse traders shuffled uncomfortably. They'd all heard the stories. This stallion had been captured from the wild ranges of Montana after leading his herd for over a decade. The Bureau of Land Management had rounded up the Mustangs during a drought, claiming they were overgrazing federal land. Most horses had been successfully rehomed or trained, but this one seemed to carry the very spirit of the wilderness in his soul. 16-year-old Cordelia Ashworth sat in the back row, her calloused hands gripping the splintered wooden bench. She'd come with her father, hoping to find a gentle mare to help with their struggling farm, but something about this horse made her heart race. While everyone else saw a dangerous animal, she saw something different in those wild eyes, not madness, but profound grief. The beast's got a death wish, muttered old Jasper Thornfield, the town's most respected horse trainer. Put 3 of my best men in the hospital. Some animals are just born bad. But Cordelia noticed what others missed. Each time the stallion crashed against the walls, he wasn't trying to escape. He was positioning himself to face the crowd. His ears pricked forward as if searching for something, or someone. $30, called out a gruff voice from the front. For the meat processors. The auctioneer's gavel rose, ready to seal the magnificent creature's fate. Cordelia's father, weathered farmer Augustus Ashworth, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Don't even think about it, Cordy. We can barely afford feed for the animals we got. But Cordelia was already on her feet, her voice cutting through the arena like a blade. $100. The crowd turned to stare at the slight girl with auburn braids and dirt under her fingernails. Nervous laughter rippled through the stands. What could a farmer's daughter possibly want with a killer horse? The stallion stopped mid-charge, his powerful frame freezing as if struck by lightning. Slowly, impossibly, his wild gaze found hers across the crowded arena. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey, civilized and wild, stared at each other across an invisible bridge that neither fully understood. Going once, Blackthorne called, his voice tinged with disbelief. Cordelia, no. Her father whispered urgently, that thing will kill you. But the girl wasn't listening. The horse had taken a step toward her side of the pen, his ears forward, his breathing slowing for the first time in weeks. Something ancient and indefinable passed between them, the recognition that transcended species, reason, and common sense. Going twice, the hammer fell. The trailer ride to the Ashworth farm was a symphony of destruction. The stallion's hooves hammered against the metal floor while his body slammed into the reinforced walls, each impact making the entire truck shudder. Augustus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white as he navigated the winding country road that led to their modest homestead. You've lost your mind, daughter, he said for the 10th time, his voice barely audible over the chaos behind them. That horse is going to tear our barn apart and probably take us with it. Cordelia remained silent, her green eyes fixed on the side mirror where she could see the trailer rocking violently. But she'd noticed something others hadn't. The stallion's attacks had a pattern. He wasn't lashing out randomly. He was testing every weakness in his prison, methodically searching for escape routes. This wasn't mindless rage. It was intelligent desperation. The Ashworth farm sprawled across 50 acres of rolling hills, but drought and economic hardship had reduced their operation to a handful of chickens, 2 aging dairy cows, and dreams that seemed to shrink with each passing season. The red barn that had once housed a dozen horses now stood mostly empty, its paint peeling like old skin. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Augustus caught sight of his wife, Magnolia, standing on the porch with her arms crossed. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression could have frozen water in July. "Augustus Ashworth," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years of marriage. "Please tell me you haven't brought home what I think you've brought home." Before he could answer, their 12-year-old son, Bartholomew, came running from the chicken coop, his face lighting up with excitement. "Is that the crazy horse from the auction? The one that nearly killed 3 people?" "Nobody's getting killed on my watch," Magnolia declared, but her stern expression softened as she looked at Cordelia. "Child, what were you thinking?" The trailer had gone suddenly quiet. Augustus and the neighbors who'd followed them home to watch the spectacle exchanged uncertain glances. Even the most experienced horsemen in the county had gathered to witness what they assumed would be either a miracle or a tragedy, possibly both. "He's been caged for 3 months, Cordelia said quietly, stepping down from the truck. "Would you be calm if someone stole your family and locked you in a box?" She walked to the back of the trailer, ignoring the alarmed protests of the gathered crowd. Her hand rested on the latch, but she didn't open it immediately. Instead, she began to speak in a voice so soft that everyone had to strain to hear. "I know you're scared," she whispered to the silent trailer. "I know you miss your home, your herd, your freedom. But I'm not your enemy. I'm not here to break you or change you. I just want to give you a choice." The latch clicked open. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the trailer door swung wide, revealing the stallion's magnificent form silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. His coat was streaked with sweat and blood, his mane tangled with burrs and debris, but his eyes held a clarity that made everyone take an involuntary step backward. He descended the ramp slowly, his hooves ringing against the metal like a funeral bell. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the explosion of violence they'd all witnessed before. But the stallion simply stood there, his massive frame trembling with exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that went beyond the physical. Cordelia approached him with the same careful grace she used when approaching wounded wildlife. "You don't have to trust me," she said, her voice carrying across the silent farmyard. "But you don't have to be afraid anymore, either." The stallion's ears flicked forward. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent-opened hay and something indefinably safe. For the first time in months, he lowered his proud head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of something he couldn't name. Behind her, Cordelia heard her father's sharp intake of breath and her mother's whispered prayer. But she kept her focus on the horse, on the moment when Wild met Gentle and found, to everyone's amazement, that they spoke the same language. 3 weeks passed before the stallion allowed Cordelia within arm's reach, and even then it was on his terms. Every morning before dawn, she would sit in the corner of the pasture with a cup of coffee and a book, never looking directly at him, never making demands. She simply existed in his space. as patient as the sunrise and twice as persistent. The horse had claimed the farthest corner of the 40-acre pasture, positioning himself where he could see all approaches, while keeping his back to the ancient oak tree that had weathered a century of storms. The other animals gave him a wide berth even. The barn cat seemed to sense that this was a creature operating by different rules. Augustus watched from the kitchen window each morning, his worry lines deepening with each passing day. That horse hasn't eaten proper feed since we brought him home, he told Magnolia as she scrambled eggs for Bartholomew's breakfast. He's living on grass and creek water like he's still wild. Maybe he is still wild, Magnolia replied, thoughtfully. Maybe that's not something you lose, even when everything else gets taken away. But Cordelia had begun to notice changes. The stallion's coat, once dull with despair, had begun to gleam in the morning sun. His eyes, while still wary, no longer held the desperate fury that had characterized his auction house days. He was healing, but not in the way anyone expected. On a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and cold, Cordelia made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been reading in her usual spot when she noticed the stallion limping. Not the dramatic limp of a fresh injury, but the subtle favor of old pain. She set down her book and, for the first time, spoke directly to him. "You're hurt." The stallion's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward. They'd been sharing space for weeks, but this was the first time she'd acknowledged him directly. "It's your left front hoof, isn't it? From all that fighting at the auction house." She rose slowly, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. To her amazement, the stallion didn't retreat. Instead, he took a single step toward her, his massive head lowering until his breath fogged in the cold air between them. "My name is Cordelia," she said softly. "What's yours?" The question was absurd. Horses didn't have names in the way humans understood them. But as she looked into his dark eyes, she saw something that made her catch her breath. This wasn't just a horse. This was a leader, a king of the wild places, a creature who had commanded respect across thousands of acres of untamed land. "Sovereign," she whispered, and his ears flicked forward as if he recognized something in the word. "That's what you are, isn't it? Not a pet or a possession, but a sovereign of your own domain." The name seemed to resonate through the morning air. For the first time since his capture, the stallion's head lifted with something approaching his old pride. He was still trapped, still far from his mountain home, but he was no longer nameless. That afternoon, Cordelia convinced her father to call Dr. Evangeline Hartwell, the county's most patient veterinarian. Dr. Hartwell arrived with her usual array of equipment and a healthy respect for difficult cases. "I've heard about this one," she said, studying Sovereign from a safe distance. "He's got a reputation from here to Helena." "He's not mean," Cordelia insisted. "He's just been hurt too many times to trust easily." Dr. Hartwell raised an eyebrow. "Honey, I've got the hospital bills to prove otherwise." But as they watched, something unprecedented happened. Sovereign, who had violently resisted every human contact for months, walked slowly toward the fence where Cordelia stood. His limp was more pronounced now, as if acknowledging it to her had somehow made it more real. Without being asked, without any training or coercion, the proud stallion lifted his injured hoof and rested it on the bottom rail of the fence, an offering, a request, a sign of trust that made Dr. Hartwell's mouth drop open in amazement. "Well," she said after a long moment, "I reckon I've seen everything now." As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Cordelia gently examined Sovereign's hoof, while Dr. Hartwell provided guidance from outside the fence. They found the problem, a deep stone bruise that had never been properly treated, infected and painful, but not permanently damaging. "He'll be fine," Dr. Hartwell assured them as she packed her equipment. "But I have to ask, how did you know he'd let you help him?" Cordelia looked at Sovereign, who was already moving more comfortably. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I just asked." The late summer storm rolled in from the mountains like an avalanche of sound and fury, transforming the peaceful valley into a cauldron of wind and lightning. Augustus had spent the afternoon securing loose equipment and herding the livestock into the barn, but Sovereign refused to leave the pasture. Even as the first fat raindrops began to fall, the stallion stood motionless beneath the oak tree, his mane whipping in the rising wind. "That fool horse is going to get himself killed," Augustus muttered, wiping rain from his eyes as he watched from the barn doorway. "Lightning's going to fry him like bacon." Cordelia pulled on her yellow rein. Slicker, her jaw set with determination. "He's not being stubborn. He's terrified. Terrified." Bartholomew peered through the storm toward the pasture. "He looks pretty calm to me." But Cordelia understood what her family couldn't see. Sovereign had been captured in a storm like this, one rounded up by helicopters and cowboys when the thunder masked the sound of approaching hoofbeats. To him, violent weather meant danger, capture, the loss of everything he held dear. The barn, no matter how safe, felt like another trap. She splashed through the muddy yard, fighting against wind that tried to knock her sideways. The storm was intensifying, and forks of lightning split the sky with increasing frequency. Each thunderclap made the earth shake beneath her feet. "Sovereign," she called out, but the wind swallowed her voice. The stallion's head turned toward her, his eyes reflecting the lightning like mirrors. He was shaking, but not from cold, from the deep, cellular memory of trauma that no amount of gentle treatment could erase. A particularly violent gust of wind snapped a branch from the oak tree, sending it crashing to the ground mere feet from where Sovereign stood. The impact spooked him into motion, and he began to pace in tight circles, his hooves churning the grass into mud. Cordelia approached slowly, her hands raised peacefully. "It's just weather," she said, though she had to shout to be heard above the storm. "It can't hurt you anymore. You're safe here." But Sovereign was beyond hearing. The storm had triggered something primal in him, a flashback to that terrible day when his world had ended. His pacing became more frantic, and Cordelia realized with growing alarm that he might injure himself in his panic. Lightning struck the hilltop above them, illuminating the scene in stark white light. In that moment of clarity, Cordelia saw what she had to do, moving with the same fluid grace that had first caught Sovereign's attention. She stepped directly into his path. The stallion reared back, his hooves flashing dangerously close to her head. But instead of backing away, Cordelia did something that defied every rule of horse safety she'd ever learned. She reached up and placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his thundering heart. "I'm here," she said, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "You're not alone anymore." The effect was immediate and profound. Sovereign's wild eyes found hers, and in that connection, something shifted. The storm still raged around them, but within the circle of her presence. A strange calm descended. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed, and gradually, impossibly, he lowered his head until his forehead rested against her shoulder. They stood like that for long minutes, girl and horse finding shelter in each other while the storm spent its fury around them. Lightning continued to flash, thunder continued to roll, but Sovereign no longer trembled. In Cordelia's steady presence, he had found something he'd lost when his freedom was taken trust. When the worst of the storm passed, they walked together toward the barn. Sovereign's steps were hesitant at first, but Cordelia's hand on his neck provided the courage he needed. For the first time since his capture, he entered a human-made structure voluntarily. Augustus, Magnolia, and Bartholomew watched in amazement, as the stallion who had terrorized experienced horsemen allowed himself to be led into safety by a teenage girl. Dr. Hartwell, who had taken shelter in their kitchen, shook her head in wonder. In 30 years of veterinary practice, she said, "I've never seen anything like that. That horse would have killed anyone else who tried what she just did." Magnolia wrapped a warm blanket around her daughter's shoulders. "What made you think it would work?" Cordelia looked back at Sovereign, who was now calmly eating hay in the barn's largest stall. "I didn't think," she admitted. "I just knew he needed someone to be brave with him instead of for him." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the barn, a new kind of peace had settled over them all. Sovereign had taken his first real step toward healing, and Cordelia had discovered that sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply refusing to let someone face their fears. Alone, news of the horse whisperer spread through the county like wildfire, bringing curious visitors and desperate horse owners to the Ashworth farm. They came with trailers full of problem horses biters, kickers, animals that had been written off as hopeless. But Cordelia turned them all away, much to her father's financial frustration. "We could make good money with this gift of yours," Augustus said one morning as they watched another disappointed trailer pull out of their driveway. The Hendersons offered $300 just to look at their mare. "It's not a gift," Cordelia replied, brushing Sovereign's gleaming coat. "And it's not about money." But the attention had attracted the wrong kind of notice. Brantley Colt, a wealthy horse trader from the eastern part of the state, arrived on a Tuesday morning in a black Mercedes, his silver hair slicked back and his expensive boots polished to a mirror shine. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Miss Ashworth," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I've come to make you an offer you'd be foolish to refuse." Cordelia continued grooming Sovereign, not bothering to look up. "We're not selling." Colt's laugh was as sharp as breaking glass. "Everything's for sale, young lady. It's just a matter of price. I'm prepared to offer $50,000 for that stallion." The brush stilled in Cordelia's hand. $50,000 would save the farm, pay off their debts, and provide security for years to come. It was more money than her family had ever seen at one time. Augustus stepped forward, his weathered face showing the strain of recent years. That's a generous offer, Mr. Colt." "Indeed it is," Colt agreed, his pale eyes fixed on Sovereign with the intensity of a predator. "I have buyers lined up who appreciate truly exceptional bloodlines. This horse comes from one of the last pure wild herds in Montana. His genetics alone are worth a fortune." "His genetics," Cordelia's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Is that what you think he is? A collection of genes?" Colt's smile never wavered. "I think he's a commodity that's currently being wasted on sentimental nonsense. In my hands, he'll fulfill his true purpose, which is breeding, of course. I have a facility in Kentucky with some of the finest mares in the country. This stallion could sire champions, create a dynasty. Surely you can see the logic in that." Cordelia set down the brush and stepped closer to Colt, her green eyes blazing with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. "His true purpose is to be free. His true purpose is to run wild with his own kind, to lead and protect and live according to his nature, not to be a prisoner making babies for your profit. Miss Ashworth, Colt's voice hardened, you're being unrealistic. That horse will never be truly free again. The wild herds are gone. The land is fenced and claimed. At least in my facility, he'll be well cared for in a prison. A luxurious prison, Colt corrected. The finest facilities money can buy. Behind them, Sovereign had grown restless, sensing the tension in the air. His ears lay flat against his skull, and his eyes showed the old wildness that Cordelia had worked so hard to soothe. He remembered men like Colt, men who saw horses as objects to be owned and exploited. The answer is no, Cordelia said firmly. Colt's mask of courtesy finally slipped. You're making a mistake, girl. I always get what I want, one way or another. That horse is too valuable to waste on a failed farm and a girl who doesn't understand the real world. Get off our property, Augustus said quietly, but there was steel in his voice now, as Colt's Mercedes disappeared down the gravel road. Trailing dust and threats, Cordelia felt Sovereign's warm breath on her shoulder. She turned to find him watching her with something that might have been gratitude. He's not wrong about one thing, Augustus said heavily. The wild herds are mostly gone. Where would a horse like him go, even if he could be free? Cordelia looked toward the mountains that rose beyond their valley, purple and mysterious in the distance. Maybe freedom isn't about going back to what was, she said slowly. Maybe it's about choosing what comes next. That night, she lay awake thinking about Colt's words and her father's fears. $50,000 was more than enough to save the farm, but at what cost? She thought about Sovereign's eyes when he'd first seen her at the auction, about the way he'd trusted her in the storm, about the quiet dignity he'd maintained even in his darkest moments. Some things, she realized, were worth more than money. Some bonds were too sacred to break for any price. But she also knew that Brantley Colt wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. This wasn't over, which was just beginning. The attack came at dawn, swift and professional. Cordelia woke to the sound of truck engines and men's voices, harsh and urgent in the morning stillness. She stumbled to her window and felt her heart stop. 3 trucks surrounded the pasture, and men with ropes and sedation guns were moving towards Sovereign. With military precision. "Dad," she screamed, but Augustus was already running toward the barn, his face grim with understanding. This was a legal seizure somehow. Colt had found a way to claim ownership of Sovereign, the stallion. Sensing danger, had retreated to his familiar corner beneath the oak tree, but there was nowhere to run. The men closed in from all sides, their movements coordinated and ruthless. One of them raised a tranquilizer gun, taking careful aim at Sovereign's powerful neck. "Stop." Cordelia burst from the house, still in her nightgown, her bare feet slipping on the dew-wet grass. "You can't take him." Sheriff Donnelly intercepted her, his face apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Cordelia. Mr. Colt produced documentation proving he owned this horse before you bought him at auction. The sale was invalid." "That's impossible," Augustus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. In the complex world of horse trading and legal ownership, anything was possible. The tranquilizer dart hit Sovereign in the shoulder, and he staggered, his legs beginning to buckle. But instead of falling, he did something that made every person in the pasture freeze with amazement. The proud stallion, fighting against the sedative coursing through his veins, walked slowly toward Cordelia. Each step was a tremendous effort, his powerful muscles already relaxing against his will. But his dark eyes remained fixed on hers, and when he finally reached the fence where she stood, he did something that defied every law of nature and human expectation. The wild horse, the untamable stallion who had never bowed to any living creature, slowly lowered his magnificent head until his forehead touched the ground at Cordelia's feet. It was a gesture of such profound respect and trust that several of the hired men actually removed their hats, as if witnessing something sacred. "I can't," whispered the man with the ropes. "I can't take a horse that does that." But Colt stepped forward, his face twisted with greed and determination. "You'll take him, or you won't get paid. Load him up." As the men reluctantly moved forward, Cordelia made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She climbed over the fence and knelt beside Sovereign's drooping head, her hands gentle on his neck. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice carrying across the silent pasture. "I understand now. You were never meant to belong to anyone. Not to me, not to him, not to anyone. You were meant to choose." Her fingers found the simple rope halter she'd fashioned for him weeks ago, the only restraint he'd ever willingly accepted. With deliberate movements, she untied it and let it fall to the ground. "You're free," she said, her voice breaking. "Whatever happens next, remember that someone sets you free." The sedative was strong, but not strong enough to overcome the power of her words. Sovereign's eyes, though heavy with drugs, blazed with renewed fire. With tremendous effort, he struggled to his feet, swaying but standing proud. And then, in a display of magnificent defiance that would be talked about for generations, he reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air like a challenge to the sky itself. The men scattered, the truck's engines revved, and even Colt took several steps backward. When Sovereign came down, he was facing the mountains. Without a backward glance, without hesitation, he began to run. The sedative should have dropped him within steps, but somehow through sheer force of will, or perhaps something more mysterious, he kept going. "Stop him," Colt screamed, but his men were already packing up their equipment. There was something about the sight of the magnificent horse running toward freedom that made pursuit feel like sacrilege. As Sovereign disappeared into the morning mist, heading toward the wild country that had birthed him, Cordelia felt tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of joy, of completion, of a story that had found its perfect ending. "You let him go," Augustus said softly, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "No," Cordelia replied, watching the mountains where Sovereign had vanished. "I let him choose." 6 months later, hikers in the high country reported seeing a magnificent black stallion leading a small band of horses, former ranch animals who had somehow found their way to him. The reports were never confirmed, but Cordelia liked to think that Sovereign had found what he'd been looking for all along. Not just freedom, but the chance to be what he was meant to be. On quiet evenings, when the wind blew down from the mountains, she sometimes thought she could hear the distant sound of hoofbeats, wild and free and heading home. And she would smile, knowing that some bonds transcend ownership, that some spirits are too magnificent to be contained, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. The auctioneer had declared him worthless, but Sovereign had proven that worth cannot be measured in dollars. His true value lay in his indomitable spirit, his capacity for trust, and his unwavering determination to remain true to his wild nature. In bowing to Cordelia, he had shown the world that respect is earned, not commanded, and that even the wildest Heart can recognize genuine love when it appears. Their story became legend in the valley, passed down through generations as a reminder that freedom is not something to be given or taken, but something to be chosen, honored, and protected at all costs.